macro class.
These are basically
Okay. Hello. I'm your host tonight. I'm chair of anthropology department, which we are all members of. So we have people who are not from anthropology. No. You are adjacent.
Adjacent.
So, welcome. This is our visiting professor. His name is Jean Maffocat. Here we see. So, he's also one of the most interesting people I've ever met in my life. He's a rebel, he's an anarchist, he's a poet, he's a professor, and he's somebody who's going to be talking to us for 3 days about autonomous spaces and the ways that we can escape from the state. So please join me in welcoming George. Welcome.
Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation. I've always dreamt of coming to this place for obvious reasons. And early on in my adult life, I studied anthropology with Beatrice Nuns when I was working on Guatemalan refugees in Chiapas. As a college student, so I've always been interested in anthropology. But I'm really stunned and humbled that you would invite a stuffy historian like me to talk about things that may seem rehashed, but that I think are essential to understand the crisis that we're going through now. And I'm personally, I'm French. Je suis Français. I don't know if you told me that. That's where I was born, whatever the nationality means. I started out as an activist in France for the sans-papiers, undocumented workers in Paris, and was a member of the Mouvement contre le racisme et pour l'amitié entre les peuples, which was an anti-racist movement made up of old resistance fighters for whom the best way to struggle against anti-Semitism and its recurrence was to fight for the liberation of Palestine. So I was really inspired by that old left, which over time I realized had many, had some blindness with regard to the state, what its function is, what its potentiality is, what the republic means, the difference between the republic of laws and the republic of association, what the République démocratique et sociale, which is sort of the socialist revolutionary variety of the republic means, why people can't understand the difference between the state and the republic, and of course the big one is present-day implications of the republic. And I don't know, has anyone been to France? Every time a politician speaks, they end with, Vive la République et vive la France, right? Which is a totally empty slogan, and which I believe refers to Third Republic ideology, which was the apogee of French colonialism and the pretense of universality, rather than to more radical traditions that developed before. So today I just want to, before I delve into the Mapuche, who I'm working with in Chile and Argentina nowadays, and the concept of Guanapu tomorrow, and before I talk about my experiences and everything I've learned from the Tuareg people of the Sahelian lowlands in West Africa, I'm going to talk a little bit about this tradition of La République that we all take for granted and read about, and all the great revolutionary writers and thinkers of both genders spend a lot of time critiquing, but people nowadays may not have a lot of understanding of how it develops and what it means. So, by the way, I don't know why he says I'm very interesting, but I have lived in Virginia for the past 20 years or so, and I teach at Norfolk State University, which is a historically black university, the largest public HBCU in Virginia. And the experience of living in the American South, the experience of racism, and traveling and working frequently in the Caribbean as well, particularly to Cuba, have all really transformed my consciousness in the sense of being very sensitive and very sensitive to and aware of colonial questions, right? The critique of colonialism. So that's something that I'll get to in the next couple of days, but it's a little bit in here too. Sovereignty, as we understand it today, is a juridical principle that emerged in medieval Western Europe in the specific context of the emergence of modern states. State sovereignty is what I want to stress here, developed historically against the self-government of societies and the autonomy of individuals. We need to understand the genealogy of this concept in order not just to critique it, but to make sense of the tensions that have always existed in the interpretation of its corollary, the Republic. So for 19th century French liberals, such as Alexis de Tocqueville, they assigned the notion of a Western democratic revolution to complex developments, none of them predetermined or inevitable, that unfolded in the wake of the 1789 revolution and which eroded local freedoms as well as radical experiments in autonomy. The state emerged as a highly centralized, rationalized, and bureaucratic leviathan. The legitimacy of the state came from the transfer of sovereignty from the monarch to the nation, according to standard versions. But this was in fact not a sudden revolutionary accomplishment, but the outcome of a centuries-long secularization process of the Catholic Church and its pontificate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The state, the church, universality. These are all concepts for which there is continuity over time in France. So today, the Republic has become a kind of fetish word for defenders of order. How did it become that way, right? And whether it be on the left or on the right, there's a cult of it. There's a statolatry, a kind of an idolatry of the state, I call it, that has historical roots and that they can't seem to shed for reasons that I want to discuss today. But the Republic no longer has any proper meaning. Having become universal, locked into a literally meaningless invocation of eternity, the Republic has lost all trace of the conflicts over its interpretation. At the same time, it's found itself deprived of its emancipatory possibilities. Historians such as Maurice Agudon talk about the apprenticeship, l'apprentissage de la République, a teleological coming of age in which disruptive or contrarian flashes of popular sovereignty are dismissed as anecdotal or irrelevant to the outcome that we know. Republic as a revolutionary project versus Republic as a regime. So here it goes. At the end of the 11th century, a revolution in the papacy transformed the Catholic Church into a model for the constitution of secular state. It sounds like a paradox, but don't begin in 1648. Begin in the 11th century. Forget Renaissance iterations of antiquity and the Greco-Roman foundations of Western political philosophy. I think that a better understanding of the genealogy of the modern state, in addition to blurring distinctions between the old and new regime, sheds important light on that other paradox that folks have so much trouble understanding, that the Republic in France has always been imperial. Its claim to universality is not an accident. So the Carolingian Empire founded by Charlemagne was in the middle of dissolving, right? And territorial control reverted to feudal lordships during this period. Principalities, counties, comtés, duchies, I don't know if that's how you say it in English, the duché, and local entities in general, devolved the power of command to aristocratic landowners who controlled the economy and administered justice in the fiefdoms with unchecked authority. So the wealthiest and best administered regions embarked on the opposite route, re-centralizing themselves around principalities to create multiple feudal monarchies throughout Western Europe. There was no real idea, though, yet of the state. It didn't exist. It was a vague notion, even a mystical one, and I think it continues to be a magical notion in many ways. The church itself was scattered and often undermined by local rivalries. So, with the Carolingian Empire in shambles, popes began demanding a consolidation of the church into a sovereign entity that would not be manipulated by emperors or influenced by the wealthy nobility. So in 1059, Pope Nicholas II, decreed that popes would be elected by cardinals only, which is still the case. Only back then, the papacy was much more powerful. And in 1075, Pope Gregoire III decreed the papacy's sovereignty over the entire church, as well as the independence of the clergy from the secular authorities. So, full powers to the Pope. Emperors and kings were summoned to recognize his authority. Before that, the clergy was in a position of subordination to emperors, kings, and feudal lords. Monarchs had made laws, and clergy had administered the faith. A king held the title of Vicar of Christ, and the Pope was the Vicar of St. Peter, who handed him the keys to the church. Now the Pope would become the Vicar of Christ, the Emperor of all emperors. This affirmation of the Church's sovereignty over rulers in the temporal world and regarding temporal matters had not existed in previous centuries. The local powers that be, of course, began to push back. But the idea of a secular state without an ecclesiastical function did not yet exist. The papacy now appeared as a proto-state in its own right, with the ability to legislate over theological and spiritual as well as temporal matters, and even to wage war on princes and kings to impose its authority. The Pope was the sovereign legislator. One of the legal implications of this plena potestas, it's called, in Latin Roman jurisdiction, is that it extended to the lands of the seas and of the entire world, most of which was not yet even known to Europeans. So it created the framework within which they would understand the expansion of empires in the 16th century. So the first Western state was the Vatican. It took the spiritual confidence that kings had enjoyed away from them. The 12th century Norman Empire of Sicily was the first Western territorial state that instituted under Roger II central monarchical control over feudal lords and in a direct challenge to the Pope over the church itself. So you've got the formation of a proto-state facing down the authority of the Pope. No city was free or autonomous. All inhabitants of the island were vassals of the king, who had the absolute power to dominate and legislate. It was Roger II who promulgated the first modern legal code of monarchical governance in Western history. The centralization and bureaucratization of the state was continued under his successor, Frederick II, emulating the usurpation of absolute power by the Pope. France, though, at this time, barely existed as a political entity. We have trouble even thinking that way, as Americans do too, right, in our national framework. The king controlled about 5% of the territory, inhabited by Burgundians, Picards, Normans, Britons, Gascons, and Poles. He only reigned directly over the region between Paris and Orleans, which is a very short distance for people who've been there. Feudal lords had more power than him. So Philip II was the first king to establish an empire based on the same centralization of authority as that exercised by Sicily and the Pope. For the first time, royal officers reigned as delegates of the king in local administrations. Throughout the 13th century, French kings promulgated new laws establishing the power of the monarch, sovereign of the state. These were modern concepts, unknown to the Greeks and the Romans. The continuity of the Roman Respublica was not the sovereignty of the state, and the Greek polis before it was not even a continuous authority, since any change in political authority nullified its institutions. Sovereignty was an invention of the Roman Catholic Church, and monarchs modeled their quest for absolutism after it. This led to often violent but mimetic conflicts between churches and states. It was in the second half of the 14th century that some scholastic thinkers began invoking the Republic as a necessary expression of autonomy vis-a-vis the dictates of the church. Monarchy and republic didn't even become concepts distinct from one another until advocates of a republic began challenging the power of the monarch by modeling state building after papal revolution pushed for absolutism. This gets interesting, I promise. Meanwhile, there were a number of cities in central and northern Italy that had established themselves as independent republics in the 12th century against the papacy and the claims of authority made by Germanic emperors. By the 14th century, the vast majority of Italian communes were integrated into these free city-states, but they were republics for the rich. Gradually, paupers or the poor were excluded from civic life, and what increasingly became known as the common good. The definition of the people was written into law by these increasingly inegalitarian republics. And this was a time, as you all know, proto-capitalism, utilitarian and productivist considerations, voiced by the bourgeoisie, which took precedence over theological ones. While they did raise issues among jurists regarding the autonomy of political life, these republics did not resolve the relationship between the government and government. So between the 14th and the 16th centuries, there's this rivalry between church and state, two forces that claimed the same prerogatives. They were external to one another. One absolutist monarchy, the church, drove its rival monarchy to absolutism. The consequence of this was not just secularism, of which elements did surface, the idea that the state's temporal power should assert itself independently of the Vatican, but more importantly, the sacralization of the state. That's what I call Statolatry, and it's a concept that I'd like to develop with you today. Absolute monarchs would seek the same universal authority as claimed by the papacy. The sacralization of the power of the king drove the monarchy to assert its authority over all the other forces and subjects of the territory, including the church. We could say pontiffs and clergy adorn themselves with the insignia of power, whereas kings took on those of the church. A royal religion, and we still obey a state religion today, developed that claimed the king was anointed by God. Supernatural authority was woven into the rituals of the court. It was in the name of divine authority that kings asserted their monopoly over taxes, justice, the army, and currency, and their otherworldly power over vassals and subjects. The figure of Rex Deus directly threatened that of Papa Deus. Underlying all of this was something called religio iuris, the religion of the law. It became sacrilege to undermine its authority, the authority of the king who made the laws, just as it was under the Pope, or to question the divine inspiration of the decisions. This was not a simple return to the Carolingian era with its empowerment of kings to make theological pronouncements. It bestowed upon the state a juridical abstraction of personhood, of existence above and outside of society, and proclaimed its eternal, universal infallibility. The idea gradually emerged that the natural person of the sovereign and the abstract person of the state were not identical. The king possessed sovereignty embodied through him, but there was more to that sovereignty than his physical person. There was also an imperial institution, the state, which completed the infamous doctrine of the two bodies of the kingdom. The universality of this sovereignty rested on the idea that while the king could die, the state could not. The death of the holder of the office did not erase the office. It was the doctrine of the papacy. This became the fundamental principle of public law and was an important piece in the assertion of the independence of kings. The public arena, or res publica, was pieced together in this context with random references to legal and philosophical concepts of antiquity, which you've all read about in the report. Theologians have contributed to transferring the sacred nature of the church to the state, separating the idea of the state from that of personal power, and depicting it instead as the mystical body of the kingdom. Jurists joined the fray and entered government alongside their theologian nemesis. So their rivalry would culminate in the victory of jurists, or legislators, over theologians as advisors to the king. They would play a key role in institutionalizing the law of the monarch on matters of territorial rule, taxation, and war. They also render irreversible the emancipation of the state from pontifical and imperial tutelage. By the 15th century, vassals had become subjects, and all were subordinate to authority of a monarchical state. The mythology of the divine essence of the monarchy retained its religious undertones, but the king was represented more as superhuman and heroic than supernatural and pious. The more the state became secularized, the more the figure of the king acquired grandiosity and absolute temporal power. The more the state itself became autonomous from the figure of the king. But this was a long, drawn-out process during which the nobility became incorporated into mechanisms of state power, much as the curia occupied functions within the papacy. Sovereignty in this system was theorized by authors such as Jean Baudin as the supreme power of an authority to impose its will on everyone, above and beyond the prerogatives of any specific group within society. Baudin's 6 books on the Republic defined it not as a relationship between the state and civil society, but the absolute dominion of the state over its subjects. The concepts of sovereignty and res publica were blended in such a way as to empower the state as the sole giver of laws, in perpetuity, independently of who occupied the power. The people, or le peuple, became the signifier of perpetual embodiment in the monarch, and they existed only through him, and its unity was the condition of the nation's sovereignty. The perfect state was one in which a sovereign exercises absolute power in the service of l'intérêt général, the common good, by protecting the lives, honor, and property of his subjects. So this theory, developed by Baudin, saw itself as universal, as applicable to all states, as had the doctrine of the papacy, and throughout the 17th century, property classes adhered to this model out of fear of civil war, popular revolts, the possibility of the social order being questioned or challenged, and particularly the demands placed on the monarchy by restless subjects. There were numerous rebellions among princes and towns, parliaments, Huguenots, peasants. I mean, the idea never gelled with reality, any more than borders gel with economic and social reality today. I always think when I look at these forms of protest is, at the concept of marronage, right? The first thing that people of African descent did when they arrived in the plantation was escape it. And not only adjust their habitat to the natural surroundings, but also develop a kind of form of, a counterpower to the plantation complex that they could feed upon and work with, hiding in plain sight, forming networks of resistance without getting killed, in an area where they were clearly at a disadvantage by virtue of their legal status and lack of arms. So communitarian expressions of self-rule flourished on the margins of the emergence of the modern state. The heterogeneity of society, its regional, class, and religious divisions, bellied the claims of absolute power. The motor of centralization and unification was administration or bureaucracy. It's getting hot here. You see me sweating? Sorry.
Do you need water?
No. I'm just big. And when I get excited, remember, this is trying to make things simple and interesting that are not. So raison d'etat, which is born around this time, the reasons of state, is the name given to politics when the calculation of their finality or purpose presupposes goals of secularism over divine right. And it's important that in modern times, raison d'etat means essentially, it's the name given to politics when we're talking about the nation over association, the state over the people. As the mechanisms of proto-capitalism invested the public sphere, the idea of interest became central to public policy rather than Christian ideals of faith, virtue, and honor. Utilitarianism became dominant. The expansion of the power of the state entailed the practical functionality of laws, the legitimation of which no longer depended on justice and divine authority, but on political, economic, and military domination. The government no longer sought moral enhancement, but raw power. Politics was envisioned by the ruling classes as the arena in which their interests were protected and their wealth enhanced by state power and war. The function of war was to galvanize the people through the defense of their king around a battle against the common enemy, be it domestic, so sedition, or external, invasion. Sound familiar? National pride and the fortification of the state, they went hand in hand, right? Faith in the monarchy and faith in the nation became the new state religion. This was the context of the 30 Years' War, which you've all heard about, the Westphalian state as a secular nationalized alternative to fragmented and desacralized empires. The competition between sovereign nation states drove the global contest for territorial domination and colonial rule. Controlling populations and mitigating the destabilizing effects of conflicts of interest were essential functions of the sovereign state in the modern era, the early modern era of mercantilism. So I'm going to skip over some of the theoretical stuff here just to say this brings us to revolution. There's a shift that the revolution will take. If sovereignty belongs to the nation and the nation is one and indivisible, do you stamp out its multiplicities and divisions? Or do you channel them through representation in acts of legislation? So the revolution began with the transformation of the Estates General, you know the story, right, into the National Assembly. In June of 1789, the ascendant bourgeoisie sought to appear as the guarantor of the general interest by proclaiming the sovereignty of the nation. All of this is very nice theoretically, but of course revolutions advanced chaotically and violently, opposed irreconcilable interests, and generated an imaginary that could outlive the language of the law or the resolution of conflicts. The unresolved question of whether representative power is a confiscation of the sovereignty of the people or its genuine embodiment through institutions of the state would haunt the next few centuries. In other words, when you say the nation is sovereign, do you mean the state or do you mean the people? In some ways, the revolution was not the beginning, but the climax of a long period of gestation of this national spirit. For Sieyès, one of the famous liberal ideologues of all of this, a people becomes a nation by adunation, becoming united, a theological term that had referred to the union of the apostles around Jesus. He advocated the integration of systems of local governance into the greater unified nation, which, by the way, is the origins of the ideology of departmentalization, which intervened in the 20th century, whereby the French state, rather than grant independence to its colonies, offered that they become parts of the nation. You've all heard of this, right? Which initially fooled some anti-colonialists, like Aimé Césaire. It's another thing that I want to talk about in the writing anyway, of this chapter. So, not just regional authorities, but all forms of difference or autonomy, including older forms of association, were banned to achieve this union. France cannot be a democracy. She cannot become a federal state composed of a multitude of republics, he wrote, but must be a whole. So this is the revolution we're talking about. France cannot be a democracy. The nation was understood by the revolutionaries as not yet actualized, meaning that it had to be invented through laws, education, centralized administration, etc. And they called this the ideal of the new man. Sound familiar? Of universal regeneration by the enactment of policies designed to adjust the minds and behaviors of citizens, to bring them into unison. Social engineering here was the sole prerogative of the state, as it had been for the papacy. Billaud Varennes, a famous Jacobin, wrote, "We must, so to speak, recreate the people to whom we bring freedom. The revolutionary state must impress upon the people their own will to be reborn differently." That could be a quote from Chirac. I mean, there are a lot of parallels here. So the sans-culottes, the actual people of Paris, diverged from all of this by asserting through an insurrection in August 1792 their own autonomy and struggle against the National Assembly. Montagnard and Jacobins had to take their force into account, maneuver to control it politically, but in 1793 the sans-culottes surrounded the convention, had the Jacobin deputies arrested. There were uprisings in the countryside against the privileges of lords. People were attacking castles, cutting off heads, and there was the storming of the Bastille in Paris and the Jacobin-led insurrections of 1795. All of this expressed a groundswell of collective rejection of the evident continuation, albeit in new form, of absolutist mechanisms of state control. Later, this episode of popular uprisings would be recorded as a spontaneous and irrational outbreak of crowd violence, a favorite expression of historians. But the popular revolutionaries who had the right of insurrection inscribed in the Constitution of year 2 of the new calendar actually set into motion forms of organization that would consistently reappear in revolts throughout the 19th century. General assemblies of localities and sections, mobilization of the National Guard under the command of the Commune, intense political campaigns at a municipal level and in political clubs. There was a general wave of new forms of association and mobilization that interpreted the laws of the revolutionary state freely and kept the state itself at a distance. Dozens of societies, much more radical than the Jacobin clubs, sought to revolutionize social relations in a search for equality, forming new local offices and promulgating economic measures inspired by custom and communitarianism that went against the whims of the market and property. These revolutionary movements may not have ultimately prevailed, but they did contribute decisively to the destruction of older forms of caste and privilege, the removal of entrenched authorities, and the myth of a revolution made by the people, for the people, in the spirit of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. The sans-culottes represented the people as one and united along the principles of liberty and fraternity. They sought unanimity and distrusted any internal sign of dissent that smacked of divisionism or self-serving intents. Sound familiar? They undertook an intense labor of correspondence between committees and among communes in an effort to coordinate the movement from below without falling into the trap of centralization. Bureaucratic measures and divisionism were deployed by the enemies of autonomy and direct democracy within the revolutionary government to prevent this momentum from acquiring national coherence. Later, liberal and Marxist historians of the revolution would agree that it was essentially bourgeois, national, and statist, and to discredit or diminish movements that stood in the way of constituent power as state rather than local sovereignty. These interpretations deny that the popular revolt, with its social characteristics and economic demands, prefigured in embryonic form another type of power than that of the church or the central state. Sieyès, the iconic liberal theorist of the New Republic, stated that administrative and legislative alienation triumphed out of necessity over local economy, popular autonomy, popular mobilization, and federalist dynamics. Proudhon would become the lettered voice of the opposite analysis, that the state had in fact usurped the popular will. In 1792, Robespierre, remembered as the Jacobin embodiment of revolutionary intransigence, said this: "The plebe, as a radical sector of society, has no right to substitute itself for the people as the general interest." Yeah, ponder that for a minute. The struggle over which forces represented the will of the people raged in 1793 and 1794, resulting in purges, repression, reforms, leading to the Montagnard Constitution and its marginalization of Girondin federalists as well as autonomous communes. I'm not synthesizing big histories here. Jacobins waged a war to monopolize power over the internal enemies of the state. In September 1793, the terror imposed its authority in the name of the battle against counter-revolutionary elements and the threat of foreign intervention. It was a disavowal of the principle, theological in origin, of the unity between the head, the convention or the state, and the body, the people, in favor of the domination of the former over the latter. Autonomy, federalism, and popular sovereignty were combated as representing what contemporaries call anarchy. Fascinating. The use of that term, that early. Girondins and communards were lumped together in an official policy against all particularisms. Think about that, because the term particularism keeps coming up whenever France rejects any change in the constitution of its cultural fabric, right? Most famously those of language. Regional languages were banned. And the French language imposed by law as that of the centralized state. So it's not like people gradually started wanting to be French. This happened again in Ukraine. And it happens all the time in places like Africa. The goal of Thermidor and the new constitution that brought into existence the Directoire, was in accordance with the teachings of Sieyès to protect the National Assembly from any incursions of the uncontrolled masses. After that, the political vocabulary of republic, citizenship, democracy, sovereignty, and representation designated mechanisms of state power as solely endowed with the right to govern through limited suffrage. The Revolution of 1848 revived the principles of 1789 and the popular struggles of the early 1790s. Not as a continuation, but in response to the devastation of war, imperial usurpations of revolutionary imagery, the restoration of the monarchy, and restrictions on public freedoms imposed by the liberal state. So there's a paradox. Right around this time, 1830s, 1840s, a racial paradigm had become completely convergent with Republican ideology. We're talking over 150 years ago. And its aspirations to empire as well, in the name of revolution, with colonization begun in 1830 in Algeria, seen as the fulfillment of human progress, as promised by the revolution, according to the interpretation of Jules Michelet. A racism different from the purifying racialism of the likes of Vacher de la Pouge and Count Gobineau in the 1890s, during the apogee of nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-immigration, to cold. One which viewed republicanism as a universal egalitarian response to backwardness and cultural relativism. Historian Christophe Schau called this the invention of imperial French society, a national habitus applied to the world at large by the extension of Republican state power to the colonized world. Napoleon III was the incarnation of this ideology. Between the second abolition of slavery in 1848 and the apogee of French colonialism in the Third Republic, Imperial France expanded to West Africa, New Caledonia, parts of China, Cochin China, and Cambodia, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Algeria became a veritable colonial laboratory of republicanism, and the public was summoned to celebrate the greatness of the nation through the global ambitions of the state. All this was a prelude to the Third Republic, which represents to this day the reference of universalist and state-centered republicanism against the popular republicanism of the people in arms that had expressed itself in the Revolution and in 1848. On May 5th, 1865, Napoleon III stated, "Perhaps there will come a day when the Arab race, regenerated and blended with the French race, will once again acquire the greatness that for centuries rendered it the master of the southern and Mediterranean shores." After the crushing of the Paris Commune, colonists in Algeria regained control over the colonial administration through a series of decrees eliminating all indigenous representation in the local administration of the territory. The glorification of empire through international expositions, the racialization of inequality promoted by the new sciences of geography, anthropology, and ethnology, and the control of urban masses through the development of prisons, asylums, and restrictive labor legislation would characterize the closing decades of the 19th century and their cult of the state, or Statolatry. Napoleon III had laid the basis of colonialism in Africa and Asia to compensate for the loss of American territories in 1804 after the Haitian Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase, and the rise of British imperialism in India and the Pacific. A fraction of the Republican movement wanted to undo this colonial heritage, but it did not prevail. Nationalism and the reversal of defeat and decline now went hand in hand. For French elites, with the affirmation of superiority and greatness of French Republican models extended, like papal authority before it, to the entire world. The new racialism of the Republic opposed the nobility and its purported origins in the Germanic race and the descendants of the Gauls. They came up with this idea that nobles had blood from the Germans and Gauls were the true French. You know, ergo the bourgeoisie. So the Gauls would therefore be represented as the direct ancestors of France as a bourgeois and popular nation. Augustin Thierry, who theorized this proposition in the 19th century, used the racialization of collective identities such as Celts, Gauls, Saxons, Germans, to assert the superiority of the bourgeoisie with regard to the aristocracy, as well as to lay the foundation for the authentic French nation, in a narrative that would be taught to colonial populations as their own during subsequent decades, and would fuel nationalist campaigns against German society based on race, leading up to the 2 world wars. The same Thierry would write about the 1848 revolution as an example of the damage done to the Republican unity of the nation by class struggle, an expression invented not by Marxists, but by liberals. Did you know that? Who saw the constitutional monarchy as a barrier against division and hatred among French. His brother, Amédée Thierry, celebrated in school manuals during the Third Republic, portrayed the Gaulois people as possessing permanent moral, intellectual, and physical qualities, transmitted by blood that distinguished it from other races, Germanic, Slav, Finnish, etc. Racial thought would attract numerous French scholars and publicists who regarded themselves as imperial republicans. Race in this tradition referred to the people, rather than the species or subspecies, as in biological races. And the progress of civilization was understood as the assimilation by all peoples of the ideals of modernity represented by the French République. Liberal French Republicans such as Tocqueville and Renan would reject the overtly supremacist writings of Gobineau, Vacher de Lepouge, and others, grounded in a pessimism of decadence and hybridity, in favor of a celebration of French values, particularly education and meritocracy, and their usefulness in modernizing the French state, as well as the traditional colonized culture that gave France a mission to civilize them. France, these universalists argued, is not a race per se, but a nation with a role determined by the naturalization of national and racial differences. So during the Third Republic, citizens were legally distinguished from foreigners for the first time. Isn't that interesting? And non-citizens according to criteria that did not conflict with the racial representation of society. The dangerous classes, as they were often called, like colonial peoples, needed the intervention of the Republican state to overcome their inferiority. In the colonies, the Code of Indigeneity, the Code de l'Indigénat, was established to block citizenship of subject peoples, and get this, individuals who through education and assimilation achieved the requirements of citizenship were legally classified on their ID cards, also a modern invention, as évolué, evolved.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a late 19th century technique. It's almost bad. The idea of the Republic as a revolutionary people in struggle was totally dissolved into that of a nation with a civilizing mission, and the state as the engineer of modern society. At odds with the universalist principles of the original Republic, socialist and liberal politicians and colonial administrators shared, to varying degrees, differentialist and inegalitarian representations of the social order. And they still do, in my opinion. As an example, the government of the Popular Front in the 1930s officially recognized the importance of the colonial empire to the international prestige of the nation. Anti-fascism was not yet ready to recognize the equality of people of color. Anne Laura Schuller rejects the concept of amnesia to designate the unwillingness of contemporary Republicans to acknowledge their colonial genealogy. She speaks instead of colonial aphasia, a term that avoids the pitfalls of pathologizing the loss of memory and stresses instead the voluntary erasure of an inconvenient truth in the face of an absence of vocabulary with which to designate it. A conceptual impasse inherent in reconciling the radical tradition of republicanism with the elitist, racist, and state-centered narrative of revolutionary continuity. 1848 was in fact a fundamental breaking point within the Republican tradition, during which the revolutionary promise of 1789 was seen as having been flustered by the exercise of state power by liberal elites. Liberalism then was still fluid, It was a vague idea invented by its antagonists to denounce it. Nobody said, I'm a liberal. Right. The enemies of liberalism were royalist and reactionary forces behind the Restoration of 1815. Charles X barred all liberal propaganda in 1830 and was immediately overthrown. First revolution. What followed was the July monarchy, which consolidated the notion of a representative government controlled by liberal elites through a strong state as an alternative to the riotous anarchic dissent of radical popular movements, who had confused in the tumult of 1789 revolution with democracy and social transformation. The novelty as industrialization progressed was the occurrence of insurrections such as that of the Canute in 1831 that interpreted freedom through the lens of class struggle, a term invented by liberals to designate the threat to national unity. Those liberals who embraced the eruption of workers onto the national stage, such as the Société des Amis du Peuple, Society of Friends of the People, began recruiting them in defense of radical Republican principles. The society then changed its name to the Society of Human Rights in reference to the original 1789 Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. During the many protests that followed, the expression proletarians was increasingly embraced to designate the genuine people of France. Le peuple français, les prolétariens, we're talking about the 1830s. Workers themselves did not suddenly discover their exploitation, but they increasingly interpreted it through the lens of an authoritarian statist liberal regime of the July monarchy. So republicanism was at a crossroads here, divided between a bourgeois liberal and an artisan working class faction. This is the radical republicanism that disappeared into the opaque archives of the Third Republic and its unflinching Statolatry. What changed in 1848 was an emphasis on association rather than representation. Because the representation of workers was blocked by liberal capitalist institutions, autonomy and direct democracy became the means by which republicanism could regain its original momentum against the laws of the rich. Strikes and interventions in municipal government broke out in the 1830s and 1840s, now defined by a radical Republican such as François Arago, as reflecting a demand for the organization of labor and radical electoral reform. So against this movement was a guy named Adolphe Thiers, who was also a liberal and president of the ruling council within the July monarchy. And he declared in 1840, I quote, "Tell the people that by changing political institutions they will achieve well-being and you will make them anarchists, nothing else." This is the leader of the march. In 1848, the people of Paris erected barricades, occupied mayorships, invaded the Tuileries and other monuments of the state, and painted their insurrectionary message all over the walls of the city, tearing down official proclamations and edicts of the government. The Emperor Louis-Philippe abdicated, and the last bastion of military resistance, the Château d'Eau, was taken over by workers without weapons. Freedom of the press and association were proclaimed and heralded at the onset as the end of exploitation man by man. And guess what? One out of classes, engendered. So they thought the state was withering away, exploitation was ending, right? And social classes would no longer exist. This was the radical utopia of this Republican movement. This tremendous desire for total freedom and radical emancipation from the sufferings of nascent industrialism would later be dismissed by its antagonists, from law and order liberals to Marxists and critics of the radicalism of the French Revolution, as an anachronistic and illusory episode in the manifest destiny of liberal capitalism and bourgeois rule through the Republican state. Yet its impact was profound. The revolution established a provisional government, a national guard, a powerful government commission named after the Luxembourg Gardens, where it held court, to hear the demands of Parisian workers, who were its organizers, and translate them into egalitarian social policy. The stated goal was to abolish property and all limits to popular sovereignty, including the repressive institutions of the previous liberal regime and its limited system of sovereignty through representation. The right to work was legally proclaimed. Sounds a lot better than it does. And workers summoned to create associations that would prevent the bourgeoisie from appropriating the fruits of their labor. Let's not let them make profits. From almost complete illegality to the highest power of the state, such associations produced a flurry of progressive measures designed to create what was called the République démocratique et sociale. That's the one that mobilizes crowds today. The democratic and social republic. Newspapers, clubs, and resistance societies appeared to fortify the participation of the working poor and artisan corporations in the making of public policy. Louis Blanc, the socialist and one of the initiators of the revolution, represented the government in this discussion with workers of the Luxembourg Commission. Had that body not been established, he would perhaps have represented the workers before the government. The socialism he embodied saw the, quote, parliament of the proletariat, as he called it, as a contained mechanism to avoid class conflict and civil war, and preserve the overarching sovereignty of the state. Karl Marx, an active participant in the movement of Parisian workers' clubs, would later call the commission a, quote, socialist synagogue, decrying the immaturity with which it privileged autonomy over legislation. Working class and artisan delegates in the commission saw the body differently, as an arena for discussion and autonomous resolution of conflicts, creating the conditions for the emergence of the proletariat as a class within the Republican framework that created the conditions for freedom. This was a first. Workers were at the center of a movement intended to transform social relations and impose popular sovereignty, with all of their flaws, such as constantly rejecting overtures by new feminist movements and colonized peoples to join the revolution. So the reaction of the property classes was immediate. In June of 1848, the revolution was grounded in fierce repression, and moderate bourgeois liberals proclaimed their attachment to a limited regulation of the state by the national state. Subsequently, the demand for a democratic and social republic became a rallying cry, and association became a priority for labor movements. The archive of the proletarian dream, to paraphrase Jacques Rancière, if I translated that correctly, did not disappear with the closing of the Luxembourg Commission. The Party of Order, represented by the likes of Alexis de Tocqueville, triumphed, and then the Statolatry of Republican representations were restored. Agitators and conspirators were mercilessly persecuted. The image of the people popularized by such authors as Victor Hugo, everybody loves Victor Hugo, right? Was that of an indiscriminate, desperate, and threatening mass of impoverished and undereducated paupers. Workers were entirely absent from Les Miserables. The working class became the mob. The influence of Proudhon grew in subsequent decades as a counterpoint to the statist agenda of the socialist clique. By the time the French labor movement achieved unified representation in the International Workers' Association in 1864, his influence was dominant. Federalist and mutualist principles grounded in the plurality of social identities and forms of belonging prevailed. This was dominant. Marx would conclude that the ephemeral republic of autonomous workers was a mistake, a sign of political maturity. His economic determinism led him and Engels, authors of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, to argue that the proletariat would have to endure a period of domination by the bourgeoisie before it could itself take the reins of revolution and abolish capitalism, right out of China today. The 18th Brumaire, Louis Bonaparte, declared that the defeat of the 1848 revolution was inevitable. As for liberals, equally deterministic, their writings would assert that the brief Second Republic from February 1848 to December 1852 represented the definitive inauguration of French representative democracy as the sole horizon of the project begun in 1789. Yet it represented a powerful antidote to those who would confine the insurrections of 1783 and 93 and 94 to the dustbins of history, as well as to the idea that popular republicanism inevitably led to terror. The spirit of 1848 reemerged in 1871 in the Paris Commune. I wish I had 2 hours. Between the end of the Second Empire and the birth of the Third Republic. For a period of 6 dramatic weeks, the idea of self-representation of workers, and this time including women, was enacted by the people in arms, ending in a wave of fierce repression in which over 10,000 people died. The idea of the sovereignty of the people and of any alternative to a republic, confused with the institutions of state power, also died, at least for a while, although the Commune would serve as a reference for insurrectional movements and revolutions for decades to come, and I can tell you through experience, it's the only thing young people talk about in assemblies today. The Versaillais who defeated the Paris Commune called it the end of history. Familiar, isn't it? And the Conservative Republic, not just called La République, period, settled in as the only path towards stability and national greatness, which had been maligned by the defeat of France at the hands of Germany. The repression extended, and it's no accident, I wish I had a couple hours, to Algeria, the paradigmatic Republican colony, where a communitarian insurrection of the Kabyle people, how do you say Kabyle in English? Kabyle. No one Kabyle? No one says it that way?
Say people don't talk about it.
Oh.
So that's the only way.
A communitarian insurrection of the Kabyle people was designated as jihadist and its repression resulted in the massive transfer of land from Algerian farmers to French colonists. Also familiar, isn't it?
Beverage, stay where you are. We have questions.
I'm sure you